So thank you for the invitation, Hyatt, to speak to another group again. It's always lovely to see familiar faces and new faces. And yes, well, my name is Tanja Boness. I live in Germany. I am actually German, but I grew up in a very international environment, always worked for international companies until many years ago. I decided to do what I do best, and that's to coach people as an IEQ9 Enneagram coach. You can see it in the background. It looks very mystical. It isn't really. We had a few sessions on the Enneagram here as well a while ago, together with Hyatt actually. And I do work very individually. I never do group work. I only do one-on-one sessions because I think they're just so much more sustainable and have such great effect and impact on people that I always prefer to do it like that. And one topic, and that's so interesting that I was asked to do this topic here, is so many clients come to me, and essentially it comes down very often to the inner critic, not knowing how to deal with it and not even knowing where it actually comes from. And I'd like to give you, I always like quotes from famous people because they say things sometimes so much better than I do. And I'd like to start with a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt, who once said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." And I think that's an absolutely beautiful quote, and it's so true. We just forget it a lot of times. So our inner critic is probably one of our absolute worst enemies. And the funny thing is that we nevertheless very often hamper and pamper it and give it so much more space in our lives than it actually deserves. And we beat ourselves up, we judge ourselves, we compare ourselves to others, and we even tend to sabotage ourselves in our life. So the question is always, why is it so unbelievably challenging and so difficult to shut that inner critic out and to silence it? And of course, as always, the inner critic differs for every individual and always depends on many, many factors. And I'm sure we will not be able to cover them all, but maybe in the discussion later, we have some more things we can cover personally from any of you, if you'd like to share. But it always, without exception, starts early in our childhood, and it has a lot to do with shame. And that can become a kind of shame spiral of not being good enough for anyone or anything. And there's so many questions we need to ask ourselves, especially concerning our childhood, is, for example, were we accepted by the people around us as we are? For example, if you could not sit still easily, be it at home or in school or at dinner table? Was that accepted, or were you scolded? Were you shamed into sitting still and behaving properly as it was supposed to be? Or were you someone who's very curious and always kept asking questions, unnerving people? I was one of those. I still am. Or were you clumsy, that you dropped things, you banged against something and made things and broke things, and that, for example? And another question that is really important is were we encouraged and challenged? For example, when we wanted to try something new, be it a sport or an instrument, even if it was just on a whim because other friends of ours wanted to do that as well, or were doing that, and we wanted to be part of that and wanted to belong to that certain group, was that encouraged or not? Were we praised or blamed? I think that's something that's really, really important for every child, or in our childhood. Were we praised to success, or were we shamed into failure? I'm a true believer, and that's how I raised my children. And even when I work with people in the work area, when I work with teams or with groups, or which I do sometimes, but it's for me, or when I do my leadership trainings, I always encourage to praise people to success and not shame them into failure, because that's the worst thing you can do. That's how you break people into submissiveness, but you will never get their full potential. And there's no use of sense in that. So then, were the good things taken for granted and the bad things overrated and even blown out of proportion? For example, as a child, when you come home with good grades, were you praised for that? Did they make a big deal out of it? Or was it just taken for granted, like, yeah, that's what we expect of you? And when you got a bad grade, were you belittled and said, how could that happen? And I hear some people have their videos on. I love that. And I can see the faces. And I think some people recognize this narrative exactly. And it even happens today in the workplace. You know, people say, well, yeah, for your salary, it's expected of you to do a good job. But it doesn't cost anyone anything to say, you know what, that was a really tough day-to-day job, well done. That makes you feel so good. But when a tiny thing goes wrong or doesn't work the way it was expected of you, it is completely blown out of proportion, and you have to come into the boss's office and get a telling off. Makes no sense. But it's something that nourishes our inner critic all the time. And I just mentioned some of that, where we constantly criticized and made feel even inadequate. So did you hear a sentence like, can't you do anything right? Or what's wrong with you? Or are you stupid? You should know that by now. And these are all things that hurt us on such a deep level that sometimes we don't even remember those sentences, and are surprised when certain phrases or certain even little things that are not meant that way trigger us, or trigger the inner critic, making us feel small and shameful and worthless and meaningless. So were we strengthened and motivated? So maybe you heard a sentence like, you know what, it's amazing how quickly you learn. Well done. Or, wow, you did that all by yourself? That's amazing. And wow, what gave you that idea? So wherever was interest really shown in what you do, and did people acknowledge what you were doing, makes such a big difference. And it doesn't give the inner critic, when you were raised like that, it doesn't give the inner critic that much chance to even grow. I can only speak for myself with my children. I raised 2 children on my own. My daughter's 22 now. She goes to university in England. My son just finished school. He's going to go to university next year. And they have this amazing self-esteem. And even my daughter has learned to put herself first. And she says, I'm great the way I am. I'm perfect. I wouldn't change a thing about me. That's the moment when I know I did something right. I'm sure I did lots of things wrong, but that I managed to do right. And also, did we feel the need to always be better than others? And I mean, so did we have that need to feel recognized or even loved, that we had to earn that recognition, that we had to earn that love all of the time? Or did you always have this, this competitive feeling that, okay, I always have to go the extra mile so people will like me? And even something that sounds maybe even a bit trite, but how we deal with sexuality in childhood always plays a big role, how we deal with it as an adult. So was it talked about openly in the family? Was it seen as something normal and as an important part of life? I'm talking about at a certain age, please. And was one educated about sexuality or intimacy by the parents, or did that happen in school or by friends, or worst case, even by pornography that you stumbled across? So all of these things have such a huge impact that we think we need to be this perfect person all of the time. And also another thing that is really, I believe, really important is how we deal with death. You might be surprised to hear that here in connected to the inner critic, but was it seen as something that is sad as it may be, as an inevitable part of life, Or was it something that was not even spoken about? That you dared not, when somebody passed away, that you were not allowed to even speak about that person? Or was it openly discussed and with the happy times shared about that person? I lost a lot of people in my life, even my little brother when he was only 27. And in my family, for example, I spoke about it with friends, but in my family, it was not spoken about at all. It was like he never existed. And so I think a part of the inner critic is characterized also by the suppression of all taboo topics. And I believe this is probably the basis, all of what I mentioned now, for the power that the inner critic has over us in our life, and actually very much determining how we live our life. But also later in life, as we grow up, our inner critic is nourished again and again. And today, more than ever, especially through social media and the constant presence of any kind of media, actually, because we are shown all the time some ideal at every turn that really, let's be honest, that no one can possibly live up to. I mean, women, you know, they go through magazines and see all these amazingly beautiful women with the perfect bodies that are, by the way, usually photoshopped. And it makes us hate our bodies, and it makes us feel horrible because we cannot live up to that ideal, and we don't need to. It is suggested to us constantly, wherever we turn, wherever we go, is that we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we're not slim enough, we're not pretty enough, we're not lovable enough. And well, essentially, we're simply not enough. We're never enough, ever. If we do not fit into this certain norm and fulfill expectations. I know that was the topic last time, but I've just a couple of sentences about expectations, because it's not only the great expectations that affect us, that come from the outside, above all, our own completely exaggerated expectations in ourselves that cause really enormous problems as we go through life. This need for perfection, this need to be not only good, but better all the time, and never being enough. So we are programmed to react so much easier and stronger to negatives, and often even finding it completely difficult and almost impossible to accept a kind word or a compliment. That we push it aside. No, it's not true. Oh no, I don't look good tonight. I look horrible. Oh, my hair isn't done, and my makeup isn't perfect. I'm tired. I have baggy eyes. I have this. I have that. When somebody just says, "I look beautiful," instead of just saying, "Oh, thank you, so nice that you noticed," and that is something. I think we have someone with an open microphone, but it doesn't matter. So there's a quote I'd like to share with you, or there's actually a bit of a part of a film, and I think it's something really beautiful. Okay, and it's a scene. I hope you can see the screen now. It's a scene from Pretty Woman that describes just that so perfectly, how we often all feel. So bear with me. There we go.
First guy I ever loved was total nothing. Second was worse. My mom called me a bum magnet. There was a bum within a 50-mile radius. I was completely attracted to him. That's how I ended up here. I followed bum number 3. So here I was, no money, no friends, no bum.
So you chose this as your profession?
Worked at a couple fast food places. Parked cars at wrestling. I couldn't make the rent. I was too ashamed to go home. That's when I met Kit. She was a hooker and made it sound so great. So one day I did it. I cried the whole time. Then I got some regulars, and it's not like anybody plans this. It's not your childhood dream.
It could be so much more.
People put you down enough, you start to believe it.
I think you are a very bright, very special woman.
The bad stuff is easier to believe. You ever notice that?
Yes. So, unfortunately, that's so true for many. The bad stuff is so much easier to believe. But how can you deal and even silence that inner critic? I think the first step you need to take is to reduce the volume of the inner critic and to really become aware of what it's trying to tell us, of what it is telling us. Unfortunately, the message...
How you doing, boy? I'm doing good. Listen, you know what? Before we let anybody tell us to start talking to us, okay.
Okay.
What key do you like to play, blues?
So, like I said, the first step is to reduce the volume of the inner critic, is becoming aware of what it is trying to tell us. And the messages that the inner critic often sends us are subconscious, which makes it a lot difficult. So the beliefs of the inner critic that we have internalized since childhood often run subconsciously, and it's not always easy to make ourselves even aware of these. It's like I said, sometimes it's just something that comes up that triggers you, like you go through the roof and you don't even know why. And I have been working on this with myself and many of my clients using the Enneagram, which is really an amazing help to begin recognize and to grasp the recurring patterns, because that's essentially what it is. It's patterns that keep and habits that keep recurring and that we have been following, sometimes even almost religiously without knowing it. So it's like always, when we recognize the enemy, then you can start finding ways to defeat it. And we suddenly have the chance to reduce and even take away the power that the inner critic has and had over us. So what follows is probably the most difficult part, I think, in silencing our inner critic. Because to get out of the spiral of negativity and self-loathing and judging, belittling ourselves, or even sabotaging ourselves, it's really essential to rephrase what the inner critic is telling us and making ourselves aware what our strengths and what our abilities are. So in theory, I know it always sounds so easy, just rephrase it and everything's going to be okay and everything is going to be fine. But I know there's always this discrepancy between theory and the actual practice of things. And it's been a huge part of us for sometimes decades, and usually decades. So let's not forget that in silencing the inner critic, we also take something essential away, because it's become a part of us. It's a big part of us very often. But something else we take away, and I've noticed that people, or I've experienced people who say that they want to change something, but they don't really want to do that because you take away their excuses. So they're not willing to put in the work, or they prefer to keep their excuses and become or stay a constant victim. But back to those who really want to change something and evolve in their lives. So instead of doubting ourselves, we can change the narrative and have an inner dialogue, telling ourselves, and I mentioned before, there's things we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, and all of these things. And if you just turn that around, and that really is very simple, saying, I am, or we are good enough, and we are smart enough. We have a perfect body, because that's That's how we were made, and that's how we're intended to be. We're beautiful. We're beautiful just the way we are. We are lovable. We are lovable for being us, and not because we have to live up to some ideal or to have to please somebody. We're lovable just as we are. We are simply enough. We are enough. And we're special. And it's a good thing that we do not fit into any norms. That is the best thing that could happen. Because the norm is dead boring. Who wants to fit into a norm, into a big pile where we can't even be seen? We're all special individuals. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things that we can realize in our lives. And another thing is what I don't do with people, because we're usually taught to work on our weaknesses. Oh, you can't do this, you have to learn that, you have to get better at that. And instead, why don't we strengthen our strengths? And we have so many of them. And funny enough, when you ask somebody, what are your weaknesses? And people go, oh, bam, bam, bam. They can come up with so many things immediately. When I say, what are your strengths? They almost choke on it. They really literally choke on it. And everybody has strengths. Everybody has strengths. And that's why I love working with the Enneagram, because the strengths come out so quickly and the motivation behind the behavior, it's fantastic. And working on your strengths and strengthening those is a lot more fun than working on your weaknesses, so much easier. And at the end of the day, that's the most important bit, it's so much more satisfying. And what can be better at the end of the day to say, wow, I've gotten even better at that. You can give yourself a pat on the shoulder and say, oh my gosh, I've actually gotten better at something. Instead, when you work on your weakness, oh, I failed again. Because you probably, the things that you don't care that much about are usually your weaknesses. And I used to be someone who always said, I was brought up to be very independent. I mean, I raised my children alone. And many years ago, I always said, I don't need anybody. I can do everything myself. And what I can't do, I can learn. And today I have the attitude, there's a lot of things I don't want to learn. I don't want to do. There's other people there that do it so much better than me. And you have the right to say that. And the funny thing is really when you play on your strengths is that you really have that sense of achievement. Excuse me. Which in turn strengthens your self-confidence. Sorry, I really have to take a quick drink. Oi. So it strengthens your self-confidence, and that again compensates for your possible weaknesses, making them less relevant, which is quite interesting because all of a sudden you don't even think about those weaknesses anymore. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned quite a few times now, is that the messages that the inner critic sends us often run subconsciously. It is all the more important to bring them into our consciousness, to the surface, so that we can really take away their power over us by, like I already mentioned, by rephrasing them. And I have another beautiful quote here by the wonderful, wonderful Marilyn Monroe, who said, wanting to be someone else is a waste of the person you are. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful quote. And it's so true. Why would you want to be anyone else than yourself? Because being yourself is what you're best at. And I suppose we all have our inner critic, and you're probably going to think I'm mad, but it can even be a good thing. Sometimes that encourages us to become better if we consciously know what the inner critic is telling us. So to work on ourselves without belittling ourselves and allowing ourselves to grow. And it might sound a bit like a contradiction to what I said before, that you should strengthen your strengths, and I still mean that, but not to work on your weaknesses, or to work on your weaknesses and shortcomings is something that happens automatically when you strengthen your strengths, because you become more confident, you become more assertive in the way you do things. And if you really are someone who wants to grow, then that will come naturally to you. So it's not really a contradiction, it's an add-on that you get. So if you imagine your inner critic like an angel and the devil, you know, sitting on your shoulders, and the dialogue they might have, helping you decide if the message you are hearing is worth listening to, or if there are arguments against it. And I think we all have that inner fight, you know, the devil angel thing telling us, oh no, that this is not true, that yes it is, no it's not, and the fight we all have. So knowing what you are up against is something that will definitely help you to silence your inner critic, and perhaps even you can even manage to make the inner critic an ally.
Right.
But it's a good timing. It's a good time for another quote by one of my favorites. It's Oscar Wilde, who said, "To love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance." Oh, I think that's absolutely gorgeous. We should have a lifelong romance with ourselves. And that's brilliant. So I'd like to go through 4 simple steps, how you can overcome the inner critic, because I think it's really difficult. It might not apply to everyone, but in a group like this, of course, you have to be stay very general. But I think there's things, if you tweak them to your own needs, I think you're on a good road. So the first step, for example, is, like I already said, is try to identify what your critical inner voice is telling you. What is it? Acknowledge that this thought process is separate from your real point of view. And I think it's important to remember that your critical inner voice is usually not a reflection of reality at all. And it's a viewpoint that you adopted based on destructive early life experiences that we went through earlier, and attitudes that are directed towards you and that you've internalized as your own point of view. But it's something that came externally. So something that was put into you can leave you as well, because it's not your nature. And I think that's really something very important. Another step is that one way to help you differentiate from your critical inner voice is to write these thoughts down in the second person, like as you statements. For example, a thought like, I can't get anything right, or I'll never be successful, should be written as, you can't get anything right, or you will never be successful. And this will help see these thoughts as an alien point of view, and not as your own, and not as true statements. And notice how hostile this internal enemy can actually be. And it is so often that we tell ourselves that I can't get it right, others are better than me, I'm too stupid for this, I'm not good enough for this. And if you really rephrase that and see it as coming from someone else, you can fight it much easier than when you say it in the I form, that you are the one. So another step can be that you can respond to your inner critic by writing down a more, realistic and also compassionate evaluation of yourself. So write these responses as the first person, as the I statements. So in response to a thought like, oh, you're such an idiot, or oh, you could write, I may struggle at times, but I'm smart and competent in many ways. And seeing the difference in that is so helpful. So this exercise isn't meant to build your ego or to boost your ego, but to simply show a kinder, a more honest attitude towards yourself. And step number 4 would be, remember to not act on the directives of your inner critic. Do not act on the directives of your inner critic. This is really, really key. So take actions that represent your own point of view, your true point of view. So your critical inner voice may get louder, telling you to stay in line or to not take chances or whatever. But by identifying, separating from and acting against, deliberately acting against this destructive thought process, you will grow stronger. And the consequence is that your inner critic will grow weaker. So whenever we recognize the voice of our inner critic, we may practice thinking, thank you, inner critic. When it bombards us with unhelpful thoughts, as it often does, we can resolve not to take the content of these thoughts too seriously. We may say, oh, God, here's the inner critic. Here he comes again, doing its dirty work, but I'm not going to listen. And even better, come up with a more specific name for it. We could call it, and I mentioned these things in the beginning, the judge or the saboteur, the wolf, the demon, or whatever label fits with the unique ways in which it tends to wreak havoc in our heads. And when we observe it in action, we may want to remind ourselves, and I think this is really important as well, that our thoughts are just words and that our beliefs are just that. They're beliefs. And these can change, and beliefs are not facts. Make that very, very clear, that the inner critic is usually something that is our beliefs that were educated or however they've gotten into your head. They are not facts. That is not you. They are nothing more than this unhelpful noise that we want to silence or help silence today, that of our endlessly chattering minds. And we are not those thoughts, and we can diffuse ourselves from these. And there's a massive difference between thinking I'm ugly and stupid and thinking my inner critic is suggesting that I'm ugly and stupid. That sounds, do you hear the difference between when you say I am ugly and stupid and saying my inner critic is suggesting that I am ugly and stupid? What an idiot. He knows the inner, and then you can really say, if somebody would say that, you know nothing about me. That's not me. And that's a way we can create a distance between the thought and us, and we can observe the thought a lot more objectively and give it less power. And at the end of the day, silencing, defeating, or befriending your inner critic has a lot to do with creating good and positive habits. Mindfulness, but also, and I think one of the most important things is self-compassion. And if you really manage to identify, and I think that's the absolute key, identify what your inner critic is telling you, then you've already won your first battle. You haven't won the war yet, but you can win one battle after the other. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And before we wrap it up and go into the Q&As, if you like, if you're interested, I have a very simple exercise that you can do for yourself anytime. If you want, I can share that with you. If you would say you'd rather go straight into the Q&A,
If you can share, I think people are really willing.
Okay, it's very simple, it's quite short, and something, I hope everybody has something to write now though, otherwise you have to listen to the video again. I'm sure Hyatt is going to share it, because it's something to help you rate your behavior rather than yourself. The goal is to differentiate between rating yourself and rating your behavior with regards to past mistakes or regrettable actions. And it really is very, very simple, because we all make mistakes, and we all do things that we're not proud of from, well, time to time, I suppose. But however, the way in which people evaluate their mistakes or regrettable actions can really, really differ. So while some people see actions like this as proof of being flawed or unworthy or whatever, others may see them as inevitable occurrences that are merely a part of being a human being. And this exercise, in this exercise, you can explore these two ways of evaluating mistakes and regrettable actions. So what you need to do is you make a list with 3 columns. And in the first column, you can write, and don't do that now, it's just the instruction of what you can do at home sometime. But if you have questions, you can always come back to me. You write 5 or 10 things in your past that you're perhaps not proud of, or that you wish you did differently. For example, you forgot your sister's or a good friend's birthday, or you said something unkind to someone, or treated someone unfairly. These things you write down in column 1. In the second column, you evaluate yourself as a person for making the mistake or the action listed in the first column. And that personal characteristics could explain the mistake. For example, forgetting the friend's birthday, oh, I'm a bad friend. Or when you said something unkind to someone, oh, I'm careless, I'm a careless person. Or you treated someone unfairly, I'm a cruel person. And in the third column, so you do that with each of your mishaps or whatever you want to call them, or mistakes. And in the last column, you evaluate your behavior with regards to the mistake. So what actions or behavior could explain the mistake you made? So for example, you could say, when you forgot your friend's birthday, oh, forgetting my friend's birthday was not very thoughtful of me. But for the other thing, I could have said that differently when you spoke unkindly to someone, or when you were cruel to someone, oh, I could have been kinder to that person. So essentially, what I would like you to do, maybe even regularly if you feel like it, is to notice self-evaluation. So you do column 1 and you can do column 2, and then you pause. And then you replace the self-evaluation with an evaluation of the behavior only. So not I'm a bad person, but this and this happened. I could have done that differently. I could have, so suggesting something, or just speaking about the behavior. And over time, you can relate very, very differently to mistakes or things you make. Sometimes they're not even mistakes. They are just that for you. So that's just a little exercise for anyone who's interested, and you can do that. And I would like to open the floor to questions now.